All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar on trade in the Biden administration. We're really excited about this unique collaborative effort between Bracewell and Hogan Lovells. I'm Paul Nathanson, Senior Principal at Bracewell and a partner in its Policy Resolution Group, and I'm moderating today's event. First, a few housekeeping items. I know we're joined by a good number of journalists who signed up, and I want to remind everybody that today's conversation is on the record. We're going to be recording this as well, and we will make it available soon on our respective firm websites. Second, as you will see in a second, we plan to have a discussion today. We don't have any PowerPoint. We don't have any presentations, no formal presentations. We want to make it as interactive as possible, so please use the chat feature to submit questions, and we'll attempt to answer them throughout the presentation. Okay, on with the show. The past 4 years have been the most volatile period of international trade in decades. The Trump administration was elected on an America First agenda to bring back jobs and manufacturing to the United States. The president imposed Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, 201 safeguards on solar panels and washer parts, 301 tariffs, and a trade war with China. There's an ongoing Boeing Airbus dispute with the EU, as well as the dispute on digital taxes. A new NAFTA was passed, Usmca, and we'll discuss its implementation. There are a record number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases filed. There are questions surrounding the future of the WTO and, of course, Brexit. And I can go on, but we only have an hour and a half, and so we need to get to the actual program. So to tackle these questions, we have a distinguished panel of professionals from my firm, Bracewell, and my colleagues at Hogan Lovells. We have collaborated on several clients on trade issues, so it's really exciting that we can bring everybody together today. So first, some very brief introductions. I'll start with my colleague, Josh Zive. He's also a senior principal at Bracewell and a partner in its Policy Resolution Group. Josh and I have worked together for over a decade. He's a triple threat, lawyer, lobbyist, and Stratcom pro. His practice focuses on international trade, compliance, international economic sanctions, foreign investment laws, and other issues. He's also a co-host of the Lobby Shop podcast with yours truly, available wherever you download your pods. Had to get in a little advertisement. So, Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Ivan Zapien is a practice area leader for government affairs and public affairs at Hogan Lovells. Prior to joining Hogan, he spent 10 years at Walmart, 7 as head of the DC office and 3 as head of corporate affairs in Mexico and Central America. He was a Senator Menendez last chief of staff in the House and first in the Senate. So hi, Ivan, nice to see you again. Jonathan Stoel is a partner in Hogan Lovells International Trade and Investment Practice and Public International Law Group. He has worked on international trade matters for more than 20 years, focusing on anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguard duties, international trade and investment negotiations, and customs issues. Jonathan and I have worked together on trade issues for, 20 years, but you must have been 12 and I was 15 because we worked together on the 201 steel tariffs in 2002. He's co-chair of the Federal Circuit's International Trade Committee and an advisor to the Georgetown Journal of International Law. Jonathan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Kellyanne Shaw is a partner in the International Trade and Investment and Government Relations and Public Affairs practice at Hogan Lovells. Kellyanne joined the firm after 10 years in government, where she held a series of high-profile jobs as a trade litigator and negotiator at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the House Ways and Means Committee, and most recently as the lead trade and economic advisor for both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. She's also an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School and senior advisor at CSIS. Hi, Kellyanne.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So before we get to the panel discussion, we're excited that we are also joined by Jonathan Tsentas, legislative assistant for Senator Robert Menendez and the senator's lead advisor on trade, banking, and housing issues. He began his Senate career in 2013 when he joined the Senate Foreign Relations Committee work on international finance development and oversight. Jonathan, I really want to thank you for joining us after a very difficult week for all Americans, but particularly for you and your colleagues on Capitol Hill. And I just wanted to say that I know I speak on behalf of all our panelists in expressing our support to you and your colleagues engaged in public service. and the work that you all did last week to preserve and protect our democracy and democratic institutions. So we really appreciate you joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. And thank you for having me today. So, I thought I'd start out the talk here with a little bit of a sense that now that we know how Georgia has worked out, what kind of Democrats in Congress and in the Senate specifically are going to be looking at over the next few years, what our priorities are, what our general thoughts are. And so the one main theme I think that we need to all be cognizant of going into these next several years is how trade policy is going to support the Biden-Harris Build Back Better agenda. And that's going to take different forms, I think, depending on which issue we're looking at. But if I had to give everybody kind of one main message, I think it's that we should start thinking about how trade policy fits into our domestic priorities first, and the other implications will flow from that. So I think one way we're going to see this play out is more congressional emphasis on transparency, on stability, and on certainty, so that our domestic stakeholders and our foreign trading partners kind of know what to expect and can make their decisions from there. So if we're looking at something like the 232 tariffs, for instance, we saw pretty early on after the tariffs came into place, a few countries received, quotas or other exclusions from that. So one thing that the Biden administration, I think, would be supportive, would find a lot of support in Congress, is to come up with a way that maybe sets some criteria out on front about what a country has to do to kind of meet the goals of the program, and apply those very clearly from the outset. And then companies or countries that meet those objectives may get some beneficial treatment. I think similarly on the China tariffs, what you're going to see is a similar process where maybe the administration does not rework the program in a major way, but perhaps takes a step back, looks at the goals that were laid out in the original 301 report by USTR about some of China's predatory practices, and assuming that the Biden administration is going to continue that and is going to continue trying to gently encourage companies in certain sensitive sectors to move their production out of China. I think one thing that would find a lot of support in a Democratic Congress is being clear what the terms of a tariff exclusion might look like, and making that process very clear, very transparent, and for a set period of time, so that our domestic industry is not constantly wondering, will this program still be here in a year from now? Will I still be able to get an exclusion? That kind of thing. I think, generally this thought about making our policy clearer and more stable up front is going to have benefits when it comes to figuring out what our domestic manufacturing economic agenda will be. I think the Trump administration's strategy, the uncertainty, the threat of additional tariffs at various points in time, I mean, that had costs, and I think that by and large, congressional Democrats recognize that and are not going to advocate for more of that. To talk about the China deal for a quick second, I think we need to look at this in terms of what can we do domestically to strengthen our economic relationship vis-a-vis China. So Senate Democrats, including my boss, Senator Schumer, Senators Wyden and Brown, introduced a bill called the America Leads Act. And what that does is really puts a focus on domestic investments that are necessary to make us more competitive vis-a-vis China. So I think one thing that you'll see the next administration do is adopt some of that and try to figure out basically, we have a number of trade agreements already in place. What do we do within those that are going to help our companies and our workers take better advantage of the terms of those agreements? Another thing that's come up lately is the expiration of GSP, the miscellaneous tariff bill. And I think when it comes to issues like that, you're going to see a lot of congressional Democrats asking, how do programs like that fit into our broader trade policy? There's been a lot of questions lately about whether, from both sides, to be fair, whether the miscellaneous tariff bill is really helping manufacturing. Does everything that, does every product that was in that bill really support U.S. manufacturing? I think you're going to see, a slightly more closer look on programs like that and trying to find ways to adjust them to, support the domestic agenda. And then, finally on negotiations, there's been a lot written about, the new administration not negotiating any new deals quickly. But I think what we're also going to see, and something that a number of folks in Congress support, is more emphasis on picking the right trading partners up front. USMCA was a unique negotiation, something we hadn't done before. But even going back to TPP, that was a assortment of countries that, to a lot in Congress, and there was never a clear rationale why some of those countries were in and some aren't. So I think you're gonna see congressional Democrats, if they choose to support new negotiations, really focus on the right partners. You've seen some advocating for continued UK negotiations, others calling for negotiations with the EU. There could be some other partners out there, but I think you're going to see a step away from that. The past practice where basically Congress gave negotiating authority to the administration and they took it from there, to something a bit more refined and more interactive between Congress and the executive. Now that kind of we've seen what has happened over the past, several years, really, with our trade policy. So, there are a lot of other priorities there from Democrats, but I'll leave it at that. And thank you again for having me.
Jonathan, thank you. That's great scene setting for us, and a lot for us to take on in the next hour and a half. We'll go to our panel now. I know that you have to run, but we appreciate you really setting the stage for us, and we look forward to working with you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. We appreciate it.
Okay, panelists, make sure you all unmute, and you be very quiet though when you're not speaking, because the mics pick up things. So let's get to the discussion. As I told Jonathan, he's given us a lot to think about. But why don't we start? Josh Zive, I'm going to start with you. Let's take a look back before we look forward. What did the 2020 elections tell us, if anything, about where the public stands on major trade policy issues?
Well, thanks, Paul. I think when you look back at this last election, it's in some ways it was a return to normalcy for the role of trade in national elections, which is those of us who really care about trade policy talk about it all the time. It is very weird when it becomes national, above the fold headlines, fairly unusual. And so 2016 was unusual in that trade policy, the Trump campaign really put trade policy front and center in opposition to kind of a range of trade agreements as a top line issue, which was rare to have it put that way for a range of reasons, many of which unfortunate. I think a lot of us would think the parties have not actually engaged trade policy discussions for a long time. And that, I think, unsettled a lot of the expectations, explains a lot of how the last 4 years happened, because we really were having arguments that we'd never had before. Interestingly, though, 2020 was a lot more like 2012 or 2008 when it comes to trade policy. It wasn't the first thing discussed. Obviously, there were significantly larger issues in the public mind, whether that was COVID-19 or just President Trump as an individual. All of those issues kind of took the oxygen away from trade policy, and it left us with two candidates who really were running on differences in detail more than broad differences on trade policy. They all were kind of running to the same themes: protect American workers, advance markets. And so in many ways, I think what was interesting was I don't think anybody can leave this election claiming the voters sent any mandate on trade policy, because it became so muddled. A very different feeling, I think, than coming out of 2016, certainly at the national level.
So, Ivan, I want to hear from you about, so what does that tell us about what's going to be the role of Congress? I mean, we heard Jonathan lay out, what he thought the Democratic priorities would be. During this past 4 years, Congress has been pretty much sidelined on trade, I would argue, during the Trump administration, with Democrats controlling both houses, although with the Senate with the slimmest majority. What's your expectations for Congress to take on trade issues, particularly, issues that were brought up during the Trump administration, for example, Section 232 reform, because we hadn't had use of Section 232 like the Trump administration used it. And, it seemed like we would get to the point where a bill was about to be introduced, but then something would happen and it was never introduced. So, Ivan, what do you think? Ivan, you got to unmute.
Apologize for that. So I think that's a great question, and not to retread on anything that's already been said. I will point out that I have sort of a different view here, right? In my mind, trade was definitely back. Right. It was definitely a campaign issue. It was a populist issue. Right. So people forget that Bernie Sanders in the last election was as loud about trade as Donald Trump, and they had a very similar point of view. Right. So, the issue that essentially trade was somehow, affecting people's lives because we had cut bad deals was a political issue that helped raise the level of discussion on trade. However, I would point out that I don't think the public stayed on the trade issue the same way we think that. When, in my opinion, what happened is Donald Trump, who became president, who understands how to exercise power, figured out that there was 99% of this, right, that he could actually effectuate, and levers that he could pull, without Congress's ability to rein him in. Right. So, he used all of these tariffs and, everything that we're discussing as a way to push around on the global scale to exercise power. And we renegotiated NAFTA, but, I'm not sure that was a thorough trade debate. I think what we're going to see moving into the next couple of years is a little bit of a return to normalcy, as we've talked about here, which really means that, I don't think that they'll be able to undo some of the China tariffs. I mean, I think that's there to stay, but I think what you're going to see is, people speaking out loud a lot more about how this affects the consumer, right? There's two things about China that were really hard to talk about during the Trump administration. One is that, everything that involves labor is moving to other places for manufacturing purposes, but in electronics, they're still pretty good. And they're still pretty, they're still like in the spot where you want to go make things. And, you ask people whether China is good for the country or not, they're all 90% will say they're our enemy. But you ask them, on the other hand, well, they're going to pay another $110 for their Sonos bar under their TV. That's a different equation. And that gets registered every day in every store. The second part, which you're going to hear a lot more companies talk about, which was difficult to talk about during the Trump administration, is that we want to end the market. You sell anything, whether your job is to sell stuff or to produce stuff to get it sold, that's a huge market. That's a market that, yeah, absolutely. If you're in the, if you're Harley Davidson, if you're in the bourbon world, if you're in the high-end market of anything, China is the place to go. If you're looking for growth, China and India are the places to go. So I think those things are gonna start to be a bigger part of the conversation.
Well, before we finish up, I'm going to get back to you about what we can expect on the first 100 days. But I want to bring Kellyanne into this discussion because, Kellyanne, you were one of the negotiators of the China Phase 1 deal. So what do you see as the prospects for that deal under a Biden administration? You heard Jonathan say, and we have a question from a panelist. Do you think the Biden administration will have the philosophy of encouraging companies to move production out of China like the Trump administration did? So let's bring Kellyanne in here and see what she has to say.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and one that doesn't have a totally clear answer at this point. But, where I go is less about what Biden thinks about China and more about what the American politic and the American constituents think about China right now. And we are in a very different place than we were 4 years ago when President Trump embarked on this aggressive set of tactics towards the China relationship, where that was largely about economics. It was about stop stealing our technology. Let's level the playing field so that our companies can continue to do business in China. And it is now morphed into something much more significant involving national security, involving human rights and democracy. And Congress is playing a really significant role. They've really stepped up to the plate on the China issue in terms of looking at things like delisting and forced labor. And the number of issues is just growing. So I agree with Ivan that the China tariffs are likely here to stay for the short and medium term, if not the long term. There doesn't seem to be a real way to de-escalate that without some meaningful quid pro quo on China's side. And having been in those negotiations, it's hard to see that happening in the short or medium term. But I think more fundamentally, we as a country have to decide what we want our relationship with China to be. Are we comfortable continuing to do business with a totalitarian regime, with a government that is more comfortable with certain actions than the American constituent seems to be at the moment? How do we feel about transparency? Those are all questions that have not come to a head, but I would imagine will be on the to-do list of the Biden administration in short order, coming up with a comprehensive China strategy of which trade is a component part.
Jonathan, I would, Kellyanne mentioned that doing business with a totalitarian regime. Well, of course, there's examples of us doing that currently with other countries. But Jonathan, how would the Biden administration manage the transition of supply chains for U.S. companies from China to other locales?
Hey, Paul, and before I start, I want to say hello to all of our clients and friends who are out there. It's great to be here with our friends from Bracewell, who we're always learn a lot from. And I also want to echo Paul's comments about last week and the tragedies that happened, certainly from our firm, and I know from Bracewell also. It's been a really challenging week for everybody in Washington. And of course, trade matters, but security and the safety of people around town is the most important thing. In terms of your question, Paul, I guess I want to step back and look at the election through the lens of, the party or the base for free trade apparently has evaporated. And where has it gone and where might it go? And so as I grew up, as a lawyer, now I say my politics, I grew up learning from trade emissaries like the great Ambassador Clayton Yiter, who negotiated with Japan and was tough on the Japanese during the 1980s, and then in his old age became perhaps a bit softer in his various attitudes. Or Warren Maruyama, my partner here at the firm, who was general counsel of USTR in Bush 43. And while of course those folks didn't believe in absolute free trade, they were willing to champion and evangelize about free trade. And my question is not so much whether that was the right course or the wrong course, but my comment is that folks like that, at least in terms of the broader political landscape today, as Kellyanne rightly pointed out, are free and far between. And so really, when it came down to the presidential election on trade, as opposed to several other issues, the band in which we were talking about in the 2020 election was very, very narrow. It was amusing to watch, a Democrat and a Republican try to outflank themselves in terms of how hard they could be on certain trade issues. And in some ways, you could argue how, closed in terms of borders and policies they were trying to suggest they might be. Now, whether reality in the Biden administration meets political campaigns, we all know from being in Washington that there's oftentimes a pretty big gap in that regard. I think what I would say is the key issue, and you heard Catherine Tai talk about this, USTR nominee Tai talk about this recently, and you've seen Jake Sullivan, among others, in the Biden administration talk about this, is I think the idea of the go it alone strategy from the American standpoint on international economic issues is not one they want to follow. And so I think whether it's our Canadian and Mexican friends, as we seek to make USMCA as successful as possible, whether it's something in Asia, whether it's a TPP light or some other form of TPP, or whether it's rebuilding our relationships economically, that is, with Europe, I think the idea will be to try to build allies and to deal with countries like China, whether you want to call them competitors or enemies, et cetera, in a way that we can have like-minded countries working together. I know Kellyanne would say, and I agree with her, doing that is hard. Saying that is easy and sounds good, but how to get from here to there, I think, will be a real challenge. And I agree with Ivan. I think with Democratic control of both the Senate and the House, now that we've seen the Georgia outcomes, they'll be really important for Capitol Hill and USTR, Tai, and others to be on the same page and hopefully see a unified American government in terms of where we want to go moving forward. Stay tuned, I would say, on that.
Hey, Josh, you and I have had a lot of discussions on our podcast about China policy and how China is playing out in the election. What do you have to say about the future of U.S.-China relations, and what kind of clues do we have from the Biden administration? They've already mentioned several, but maybe through who he's appointed, who he's nominated. What's your thoughts? And then we're going to move on to tariffs and other issues.
Yeah, let me tell you, and I think this is true for China, and I think it's also true for a lot of issues. I'm going to borrow. It's not borrowing. I'm going to steal from someone on Twitter because that's what Twitter humor is for. And I saw someone, I think it was a Cato Institute person, describe trade policy as returning to the familiar relationship between lobbyist and government. And I think that in many ways, a lot of the individual policy-specific questions that people are asking, from the granular to the broader policies like China, the answer, it's going to be tough for us to give you concrete answers because it's really about a change in process as much as it is a change in any specific policy. In a lot of ways, part of what made the last 4 years from trade policy so unusual feeling was that the people making that trade policy, the final decisions, we knew exactly where they stood on these very discrete issues from issue to issue. They had very long track records, some academic, some from a litigation standpoint, but they came into it with a really kind of very specific set of policies that we almost knew once they got teed up the way they were going to pan out. And I don't know how many of us over the course of recent years on Section 301 discussion, Section 232, you knew how they were going to play out because of how the individuals that were part of the process. I think from China down to tariffs, what we're going to see over the next year, at least what I'm hopeful to see.
We can still hear you.
There we go. I would hate to punish. That's a benefit few people can hope for, is only hear me. But I think from soup to nuts, what we're going to see is that advocates are going to play a more important role than ever in this next 4 years, because you're going to have, whether it's USTR or some of these committees at Congress, playing much more traditional gatekeeping roles between competing interests than advocating for one side of that interest. And you can see that in the rhetoric from the Biden transition already. More measured, more about weighing costs and benefits, keeping broad objectives that become very difficult to hold them to. You're not seeing them lay out, these are the 5 things we're going to do on China. They're saying what their objectives are. They're almost completely unobjectionable in the way that all trade policy objectives at their broadest sense are. But that leaves them then the maximum flexibility to execute day-to-day decisions in ways that balance the very specific facts that are involved. And I think all of us in trade policy who've worked on this year after year, the one thing you come to realize is that the facts matter a lot on these trade policy matters. And they're detailed and they're hard, and working through the economic consequences of trade policy is difficult. And so returning to that mode of collect the information, hear the arguments, render a decision, I think from China to the rest of them, that's what I'll admit, somewhat optimistic, but at least trying to be excited about seeing a return to that process that makes outcomes less certain, but also fundamentally more stable.
So, hey, Paul, can I just add to that just 2 seconds? Because I think even if you kick it up a notch just a little bit, just from a foreign policy perspective, because I think it's important when you think about the Biden administration and when you think about foreign policy and all the elements related to foreign policy, that we remember that Joe Biden is sort of a foreign policy geek. He was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee forever. Tony Blinken, all the major staff that are around him were his interns and staff directors and people around him. So in a sense, the reverence towards process and the reverence towards doing things the way in which, quote unquote, they should be done is very much a part of what the Biden is going to bring to everything in this respect. And if you look at the composition of the appointees that he's made, it's really a combination, of the Obama administration plus the advisors that advised Hillary Clinton in her presidential race. And his foreign policy staff. So it's very predictable how this is going to happen. The one thing we can guarantee is that if something's coming down the pike, we'll see it coming, because that's at the root of regular order.
That's a great point, Ivan. We're going to get back to China throughout this discussion, but I want to the host prerogative here, and I want to turn to tariffs, because I know there are a lot of my clients on, and there's a lot of steel using manufacturers on. So I'm going to put folks on the spot about tariffs in a second, but the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs have really impacted steel using manufacturers in the U.S. And right now it's maybe at its peak, where steel supplies are low, steel prices are higher than the rest of the world. Manufacturers, as I said, can't get the steel that they need. I do run a coalition called the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users. So I'm coming at it from a biased, an admittedly biased point of view, but I don't think anybody on this webinar there who would like to see these tariffs are terminated were mollified by Jonathan's remarks that, well, if a country behaves a certain way, we can maybe have some adjustment about the tariffs for that country. This managed trade with tariffs, it's shown that it hasn't worked. It really hasn't helped the domestic steel industry. All the studies show that it's really hurt American manufacturing and has done little to help the steel producers. But we know that the steel unions are very strong advocates within the Democratic Party. So let me start with Jonathan. What do you think about the future of let's start, and I'm going to talk about the other tariffs too, but let's talk about the Section 232 tariffs right now. Jonathan, what's your predictions about these tariffs? Do you think they're going to go quickly, despite what Jonathan said, that maybe they'll be adjusted? I don't think that's going to help very many people if we start fiddling around with them. So what do you think? What do you think is going to happen?
Thanks, Paul. But before I answer the question directly, I want to pay trade lawyers homage to the Trump administration, and that is, the amazing thing about the Trump administration was, we as lawyers knew what the possibilities were, but we didn't imagine big enough. So I'll tell two quick stories, and that is, once I was driving home from the office and I was talking to a client, and we've been talking about an issue, and the client says, "I'm listening to the radio. Did you hear this?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he starts talking about something that we had just talked about, that the legal probabilities of that were, let's say, very small. That's one interesting story. And then another story, which is a very wise client of mine asked me to prognosticate perhaps in my view, what was the most remote thing that could possibly happen on a particular issue. And that's why I prognosticated it and gave it to him and said, it's definitely legally possible. Well, lo and behold, a couple months later, I get the call. You won't believe what just happened today, Jonathan. And, of course, I hadn't seen the announcement yet. My clients had seen it on Twitter. And here comes the thing that I had said, was the most legally possible thing. So I want to thank Ambassador Lighthizer and all the folks out there, in achieving their objectives. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I think there were a lot of things that they did that were helpful to the American people. They certainly went all out to try to, as I think as Ivan said at the beginning, to try to push the barricades in terms of what was possible under the various statutes. I think what you will see, and this goes back to why I want to say that to answer Paul's question. I think that what you will see is a return to more normal views of the scope of the statutes. However, there is the political reality, which is once tariffs like this get into place, it's very, very difficult as a political matter to remove them because, as we often say in trade policy, there are two sides of almost every tariff. And so usually there is a winner and a loser. And so it's going to be very difficult, I think, to remove tariffs broadly. And that goes for both 301 and for 232. That being said, I do think because I foresee that this administration will want to have procedures and protocols, if you will, for sort of how to proceed, I do see them, to Josh's point, espousing some broader principles around situations where the 232s could be removed on certain countries. And I would hope also, just as a practitioner, as a representative of companies who have gone through very challenging 232 exclusion processes where candidly the decisions have been very difficult to understand, that you'll see some additional guidance on when products can be excluded from these tariffs. Because I really think that going back to the comment that I think Jonathan Tsentas made, if you're a company, you just want to know how to plan your business. And the last 4 years, while they've been quite interesting, as I said, from a legal standpoint, they've been very challenging for businesses as they try to plan, whether it's manufacturing or whatever business they might be in. And so I'd hope that we can return to some normalcy in that regard.
And Paul,
Josh?
Yeah, I was going to add to that, and I know it's tough to do this without kind of crossing lines of what we might talk about, but I don't think you can talk about these tariffs without talking about trade with Europe either, because one of the consequences of those Section 232 tariffs was the diplomatic implications they had for a lot of our friendly countries around the world, which were not used to being targeted and being called national security threats. Which was all implied in the 232 tariffs. All of that confusion and backstory also makes them amongst the easier, I think, for a Biden administration to step back from when you view it in connection with their stated objective of really strengthening our relationship with our European allies. It becomes easier to see how pulling back from some of whether it's the 232s or the ongoing fight, the Boeing Airbus fight, the fight over digital services taxes, trying to get as much of that stuff wrapped up together, resolved, and then kind of be able to roll forward with a strong EU alliance. It all comes together, right? Because that also then flanges with what we were just talking about with China and wanting to stay tough on China. So I think as anyone's looking at this, they should look at the things that Jonathan and Ivan are talking about and everyone else on this discussion, because it really is about tracking through the interests that are at play, but as applied to the specific facts at hand. And that's why the more outrageous, the more unpredictable the action of the last 4 years, usually what you're going to find is the easier it will be to pull back on it for the Biden administration. The more predictable the action, the more in line with traditional procedures like Section 301, which by themselves on China were not entirely revolutionary in their nature, those become harder to pull back because they fit inside a larger coherent strategy.
And Ivan, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to respectfully disagree with my friend Jonathan here that you can't end these tariffs. Remember back, the 201 steel tariffs were scheduled for 3 years. They were terminated in 18 months, halfway through them, because of pressure by our trade allies, as well as pressure coming from the domestic steel using manufacturers in the U.S. These steel tariffs were not really asked for by the steel industry. The Trump administration, they were the ones that imposed them. They're the one, and as well as the aluminum tariffs. They haven't worked I think that there's universal agreement they haven't saved the steel industry. There's really no purpose for them right now. They're not doing any good. And if we want to build manufacturing and bring back jobs to the United States, it seems like it'd be very important that this would be the first tariffs to go, both for Josh pointed out, if we want to build a worldwide partnership of folks who can take on China. This has been an irritant that they hear about. So, Ivan, what do you think?
Hey, Paul, because I'll take a priority of responding directly, and then of course I'll concede the battlefield to my good friend Ivan. Number one, you and I have been in the trenches many years on this, and so I love your gusto on this. Number two, I think what you just said is exactly the reason why, as I started out my remarks, you might not want to use the words free trade because those words may not have the right rhetoric today and perhaps connote the wrong things. But I think there has to be a revitalization of the pro-trade, maybe I'll use that approach, coalitions and building blocks. And I think one of the things that is attractive about the Vice President, President-elect, and I think his incoming team, including I hope USTR Ty, is I think they understand certainly the benefits of trade. And while I think they will want to be strong on enforcement issues, I think they are people who will listen and the story can be told. But I'll be candid, and I consider myself among the folks who have been challenged in this regard. We as a community in the trade world have not done a good enough job of selling trade. Mm-hmm. Why does trade matter? How does it help? What are the benefits? And candidly, in some ways, I think we've looked at some of the wrong metrics. So I think the past 4 years have obviously been a big learning process for a lot of folks. And I hope that we can build what we've learned to bear as the new administration takes the reins. Sorry, Ivan, over to you, my friend.
That's an excellent point, Jonathan. You got to unmute, Ivan.
You're on mute, buddy.
I think anything's possible, Paul. I do. It's just, we live in those days, right, where anything's possible. I think whether every element of trade policy will obviously be reevaluated based on a new administration and based on the new economy, right? But I'll go back to what I said before, Paul, which is, it's just not true that every category of products out there on the planet, that we want them back here, right? So I think there is that part of the policy that, at some point, whether it's during the Biden administration, but at some point we're going to have to chew up on whether or not, we want to bring everything back. And then once we figure out what actually does make sense, like, for example, like we've learned with COVID-19, right? What makes sense? Anything having to do absolutely with national security and being prepared for a pandemic, yeah. We want to be able to manufacture that next to every major city in America. No doubt about that, right? But like whether all our suits and ties, whether, 90% of the products that go into our cars, our electronics, I think at some point there's going to have to be a truing up between what the consumer demand is, what the price points are that are available, and truly what we want to use our trade policy. Do we want to use it around the globe? For example, I expect the Biden administration to be very focused on labor conditions, right? Being very focused on, how all the tools involved in trade affect, global warming, right? So it's going to take some time, but anything's possible, Paul. It's 2021.
I want to bring Kelly in because you're most recently out of the government and been involved in these, and I want to hear about what you think about the possibility of lifting these tariffs. And also we have a question in about are there other priorities among our trade partners that are more important than removing the steel tariffs? Is that what my perception is? It's at least the complaints about these tariffs are at least amongst the top complaints that our trade allies have, but I want to get your perspective.
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. And before I was in the administration, I was in Congress, and I happened to be in Brussels the day that the steel and aluminum tariffs were announced for a set of meetings involving, trade and digital products and WTO and everything else. And you can imagine the tenor of those meetings and the turn that took very quickly. It was incredibly emotional. And just this sense of, we are your closest military ally. How can you call us a national security threat? Very much was the view from the Europeans. And, I heard it until the very day that I left the U.S. government is just pleased to remove these tariffs. But the problem was there was never any other way to address the overcapacity of steel and aluminum in China. And multilateral efforts had failed. I was leading negotiations at the G20 in Osaka for the United States when the mandate at the OECD in the excess steel capacity collapsed because China refused to agree. And we and the Europeans almost blew up the entire communique over it. But they didn't even want to come to the table. And you talk about things like negotiating new rules on subsidies and overcapacity and state-directed economic activity. we have a trilateral process with the EU and Japan, but those negotiations just among close allies took, I think, about 2.5 years to agree on a joint set of text. So there really is no sort of silver bullet to the problem. And, I was not responsible for the decision to impose 232 tariffs, but I do certainly understand the interest in doing something, right? So you throw an imperfect tool at the problem and see what happens. But, I look at it, your question about what the Biden administration is going to do, having been a negotiator for 10 years, if I were Catherine Tai, I would not be upset that those tariffs are in place because it actually gives you something to negotiate back from, right? You can extract some sort of concession, and whether that is, cooperation to address the core set of challenges and excess capacity or something else. I don't think that the Biden administration is going to be emotionally tied to the tariffs. So certainly the pathway that Josh laid out makes some sense, but there's leverage there. And I think that the administration, if they're smart, will use it.
Yeah, I think one of the issues with national security tariffs is there's no endpoint. Jonathan, you and I, we talked about the 201 steel, and we were involved in that. That was there was a 3-year term, and then they were going to be removed, and they were removed in 18 months. These tariffs can go on for forever. So, and I know that it's a huge priority for steel using manufacturers. Related to that, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hey, Paul.
I was calling on you anyway, but go ahead.
Thank you, my friend. You're making an excellent point, and I wanted to also invite Kellyanne to comment on this, about what I'm about to say, which is, I think you and I grew up on that issue in an era when, frankly, retaliation and the threat of counter tariffs had real power. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is what I would call a diminution, or frankly, almost a willingness to what our Navy has said as an adage, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And so what we've seen is a willingness to undertake tariffs and other actions against imports or against other actions, without worrying as much about retaliation. And you can make arguments good and bad. Part of the reason that I would counsel that that's happened is that the WTO has become such a weakened institution. And so the idea that we're going to try to adhere, and I emphasize try, because the United States and, of course, our trading partners have always violated WTO norms, and that's reality. But the willingness to violate WTO norms, I think, has increased substantially, and the concern about the possibility of doing so has diminished. And so until we can get back as a global trading system to the idea that there's a certain framework that should constrain actions, including actions by the United States, and Kellyanne is absolutely right. Of course, the framework also should constrain actions by China and other countries that have broken the trade rules in the past. Until we can get back to that, then I think it's a much more open playing field. And so the things, as I said, about talking to my clients about what's possible become much bigger, and the constraints on where we go it's much smaller. So let me invite Kellyanne to comment on that, because I know she's been thinking about some of these issues.
Kellyanne, and I was going to ask you about, what do you think the future of the WTO is?
Yeah, well, at the moment, the WTO is near, if not irrelevant, in terms of international trade policy from a U.S. perspective. And, I'm a strong supporter of the system. I worked in Geneva for 3 years representing the U.S. under the previous administration. But unfortunately, it has just been stuck. We have not negotiated meaningful rules in decades. Countries don't seem to comply with the terms of the agreement. And the idea of bringing in modern challenges related to China, the digital economy, or even issues like climate seem far-fetched and really only a negotiator's dream at this point. I agree with Jonathan. I think having a common set of rules would be ideal, and a new commitment of countries to work together. I just don't see that happening in the short to medium term because the WTO just seems so fundamentally broken. But I wouldn't give up all hope yet. I just am not completely optimistic that we'll see much coming out of the WTO in the short term.
And Jonathan, before we get off tariffs for the moment, what do you see about safeguard measures like on solar panels and washing machines?
Yeah, one of the things I think that's interesting about the safeguards is that the Biden administration has said that it's not going to have any sort of new major policies or new major ideas. I think in the beginning of the administration, they want to focus on infrastructure and build back America better, which certainly makes sense. But you're going to face these decisions. You can't stop. The clock doesn't stop. And so whether it's refrigerators or whether it's solar safeguard or other things, there are going to be decisions that are going to confront the administration very soon about what to do about these tariffs. And just to stick with solar, because it's an area that I've been following closely for the past, at least 3 years now. There's an issue where, of course, the administration, I think if you look across the nominees of the administration, what's the one thing they have, I would argue, in common? They are all generally very much pro dealing with climate change. We should start to control GHGs now or yesterday. And they're, I think, in general, in favor of policies that are aimed at climate change. Well, here you have an issue right front and center, right coming up at the beginning of the administration. It's going to deal with whether or not you want to continue certain tariffs that the Trump administration put in place to create, ostensibly American jobs in various places, but that clearly harmed a key industry in purposes of climate change and GHGs. So, I would argue that it's the kind of thing where, to my earlier comment, all the options should be on the table, whether it's direct subsidies to try to producers and industries that control GHGs, whether it's something to help U.S. producers so that they can deal with a more free trade environment, but you can get rid of the tariffs. I think the sky ought to be the limit. And I would argue that when the administration is going to have a coherent government approach, as I think Josh collectively outlined in terms of broader policies, it's an area where the government should be able to get behind this and come up with a broader policy that's not just trade. It's about a whole host of issues in order to solve the problem, as opposed to dealing with the isolated trade issue, which is very important to, in particular, a lot of my clients, actually.
Yeah, and Paul, this is Josh. I just to agree a little bit furthermore with Jonathan, I think it's important also to look back at where President-elect Biden comes into this discussion as historically. I think about him in the 80s talking about the car industry, and then kind of take that same rhetoric through the Obama administration and kind of how have they approached industries they've wanted to protect. Trade has, like Jonathan said, trade is only one of the arrows in that quiver that they have, and you can use it a variety of different ways. And so if you look at like the Obama administration with the car industry, what did you have? You had all of the things that Jonathan just described in terms of subsidies and support for domestic industries, but without kind of some of the protectionist edge. You do all of the non-tariff trade barriers, but not the tariff trade barriers, essentially, to protect your domestic industry. And that allows you to synchronize your trade policy with your larger objectives, i.e. advancing a solar industry or clean energy, trying to get domestic jobs, but make it sync up with also what the outside advocacy groups are telling you is in the best interest, like the trade associations from solar talking about the long-term implications of these tariffs. So I think there is a logic here, but it's about sorting out what the highest priority issues are for the incoming Biden administration and how these trade policies serve those objectives. Because if the current tariffs are consistent with those Biden objectives, it's going to be harder for them to get rid of them. If they're at odds, easier, I think.
Well, I think a natural next topic, I think it's related, is anti-dumping and countervailing duties. That whole process, a very important part of the world trade system. But Jonathan, we've seen, over the last few years, a record number of cases being filed. It's always a favorite area to tighten up as far as making it more and more difficult for respondents and for consuming industries during these cases. I know that you have done probably hundreds of anti-dumping cases. So what do you see as over the next 4 years? Are we going to see a big change? I know that there's a big congressional component because Congress is passing laws that affect, whether it's the administration put a new rule in about the consideration of currency manipulation and dumping at margins and things like that. So, Jonathan, where do you think we're headed on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think to Paul's point, if you look at the Trump administration, you couldn't have had two more ardent supporters of anti-dumping and countervailing duties than Secretary Ross and Ambassador Lighthizer, in the two of the key positions on those issues. That being said, I don't see any reason to expect a slowdown in terms of cases, except I would argue that my dear friends at both the Commerce Department and at the International Trade Commission are frankly overwhelmed. And so frankly, for them, this has been an extremely difficult time as they try to adjudicate the cases in a fair and hopefully impartial way. I think one issue that we've seen in terms of trade remedy cases that has been a change over my career is what you alluded to, which is it used to be that I saw anti-dumping and countervailing duties sort of in this box here, and that box was helpful for a key reason, which is I thought it was something that countries could use at the right time to sort of fight out their trade wars in a limited way. It was here. Here's the fight. Let's fight. Let's go at it. Let's do our thing. And then you'd have WTO disputes or NAFTA disputes or other things that would ultimately adjudicate them, and hopefully over time they'd be resolved. What you've seen though, I think over the past 4 years, but being fair, really I think going back to the rise of the strong disagreements with China over economic policy, so really stretching back into the Obama administration, is that yes, there was strong enforcement of the law in terms of anti-dumping and countervailing duties, but they were also a proxy for bigger issues, whether it was, for example, now the currency manipulation issues that you talked about, whether it has been certain products, for example, in China that have been designed to, for certain environmental or energy practices of China. So you've seen these cases take on a broader, what I would sort of say is the leading edge of sort of trade policy. And so as these cases breach the leading edge, then they would sort of fan out and you would see the fight spill over into other areas. And the question in my mind, or one of the questions is, will this administration sort of try to put the genie back in the bottle, which I would argue is very difficult, or are we going to continue to see this sort of spillage? I think the number of cases and the number of combatants will only continue to be very active, and that's unfortunate for folks who have to spend a lot of time and money on these things. But I think whether the spillage continues, that's a very interesting question.
I want to turn to Kellyanne because we had a question from our audience about the ag trade sector. It seems like the ag sector is, given their importance for exports, are often the victims, like steel users, of our when we impose tariffs and when they become the subject of retaliation. So the question was, what can we expect about specifically in the agricultural trade sector, given the nominated leadership with Blinken and Vilsack?
Yeah, I mean, that is right. They are often hit twice when it comes to tariffs. Any move we make, the retaliation is automatically in the agricultural sector because our trading partners are smart and they will hit us where it hurts. And unfortunately, farmers do bear the brunt of that. I think that it is promising that they have, or that the Biden team has put Vilsack in there, someone with a great experience and attention to the sector. I think that agriculture is one of the reasons that the phase one deal with China is still intact. I do think that agriculture will continue to play a key role in trade policy decisions that are taken by the Biden team because they have to. The agricultural sector has just been hit too hard and hurt too much, and they certainly are an important part of the U.S. economy. They are a large voice in Congress, and I think that having competent people at the head of the relevant agencies and folks who know these issues well is really going to play to that sector's advantage. But, all of this will be sort of pieced out and parsed out as we go. I think Jonathan said this at the beginning, and each one of us has touched on this in a variety of forms. Trade is going to be a component part, it seems, of the Biden administration's broader foreign policy and broader domestic policy. Unlike the Trump administration, where it really was one of the top three key issues and in many ways stood in and of itself, trumping other areas of foreign policy and domestic policy, I think we're going to see the reverse here under a Biden administration. So agriculture will certainly be a key part. I think it's too early to say exactly what that policy will be, but I certainly expect them to have a loud voice at the table.
So let's turn for a moment to trade deals. I want to talk about the NAFTA, USMCA. We've had a couple of questions while we've been having this conversation about it. I think I'll lead off with Josh. Josh, can you give us a little insight as to the politics that went on during the what prompted this update on the USMCA? Because I know you and I worked together on it, and I just want a scene set for a moment of how we got to where we are with the new NAFTA called the USMCA.
I mean, I'll do a short version. I'd prefer not to necessarily relive all of parts of NAFTA. But I mean, I think in many ways, all of that was kind of a microcosm of all of the issues we've been talking about for the last 4 years, right? From the decades of kind of how we have failed to engage the public to understand trade policy. To me, all of that came to a head in a lot of the USMCA provisions, because there were a range of issues being negotiated that were absolutely essential kind of update issues, right? Things like the application of trade agreements to the digital economy. Everyone knows that had to be addressed, right? NAFTA was written before the internet existed, right? So in many ways, the modern economy, it didn't accommodate. So that made sense. In other ways, there were issues that almost reflected a growing sense of just public misinformation, I would say, like the discussion of investor-state dispute settlement provisions, where as a result of quite frankly, a lack of public engagement, an oral history has developed surrounding NAFTA, where a lot of people had a belief that the United States had lost a lot of cases through the mediation, through the dispute resolution process. And we were being told how we could regulate our environment or product safety because of NAFTA. It was all very odd for me, because those were complaints that were made in the 90s when NAFTA was being proposed that did not bear out in reality, because in fact, the United States had not lost any of those cases. However, that didn't matter. Right. And what happened was we went into these new negotiations. The United States, the one country that had not lost an ISDS case, was the one country arguing for removal of ISDS. And we ended up with kind of USMCA, which is in many ways NAFTA when it comes to tariffs on products that are familiar, in some ways new in a logical, kind of predictable way, not NAFTA, things like digital, and then in other ways, for industry, kind of a step back, which would be the loss of ISDS and our ability as U.S. investors to try to more effectively enforce our rights when we invest in countries like Mexico. But as frustrating as that may have been, again, it all lines up when you look back at how the politics led into it, right? A failure to explain to the public how supply chains work, a failure to build constituencies around them, and it ended up putting this in the hands of politicals where they had really nowhere else to go as policymakers. They knew they had to make changes in the direction that would appease those constituencies. No constituency had been developed to defend ISDS. And as a result, nobody was there to support it. So I think politically, that's where we go into it. Now, it's a whole, we can talk about changing Congress all we want. Ultimately, I regret to inform everyone, not all that much has changed in terms of the politics of trade. That same Congress that had to ratify USMCA and approve those changes is the same Congress that's going to have to, in terms of the fundamental views of trade, that's going to have to pass any comprehensive agreements now. So look back at the difficulties just at being able to pass a trade agreement that was almost the same as the existing one, and try to fathom the difficulties of doing a new comprehensive agreement in the age of internet disagreements.
So, Paul, if I could just add to that, because I think Josh did a masterful job of articulating how this came about, but just to be a little more raw politically, right? So, here's the difference. The difference is that we don't have a president of the United States that said he's going to do this, right? So Donald Trump put it on the list of like the 5 things he was going to do to fix every problem in America, and he had incredible pressure to do it. And on the Mexican side, you had an outgoing administration who was telling this administration that if they didn't get it done under their administration, the next administration with López Obrador would probably not get it done. So there was so much pressure. There was so much pressure to get this done, and oddly enough, as I try to tell people when I say that this was a very political animal, in every country, the treaty, the free trade agreement is called something different. Yeah. 3 names for it. Name in Canada, name in Mexico, name in the U.S. Everybody got what they wanted, which is largely a new name.
The USMCA really rolls off the tongue.
I can say, having worked on the signing documents, what a nightmare that was, going back and forth between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, just on that document alone.
I was going to say somebody who does a lot of work, as I know Paul does too, with Canadian interests. The Usmca has the nicest ring to it, I have to say. Just on Josh's comments and Paul, between you and Josh, I'm really starting to feel old here. Thank God younger people, smarter people like Kellyanne around to keep me young. When I was in law school, I actually testified to state legislatures around the country on ISDS and some of the potential risks and things like that. I can remember testifying in California and Washington State. And I guess my point about that, besides reliving old days, is we're not good at explaining what is going on. We need to stop assuming that people are dumb and that people don't understand. And we need to go out there and explain. So whether you're in favor of tariffs or against tariffs, the trade community is failing. We're not doing the job of explaining why these things matter. And I will think Donald Trump actually has been helpful in the last 4 years of forcing people to revisit certain assumptions and I think trying to build the constituency around how we go forward. I think the other thing to say about ISDS, and I'm sticking with my themes here from earlier about the WTO, is we need common principles to agree upon. I mean, I'm a practitioner of investor-state dispute resolution. I've represented both sovereigns and investors. To me, though, as a common practitioner, I'm going to upset some of my friends in the bar by saying this, having people who litigate or arbitrate the cases also sit in judgment on cases is a bad idea. It doesn't resonate well with most folks. Wait a second, you're arguing in one case that this or that is a violation of a particular agreement, and you're going to be the one hearing whether or not in another case that same issue in fact violates a different treaty. Guess what? Most people, again, to my fundamental point, aren't stupid. They think that suggests a bias or a prejudice that really doesn't make sense. And so the community, and I have to say, pointing the finger here, mostly lawyers, needs to be smarter and wiser and stop thinking that we're going to fool everybody. We need to be straightforward about these things. We need to have public transparency. We need to have common sense, and we need to convey the pros and cons of key policy issues so that not just policymakers like Jonathan Tsentas, our good friend who was with us earlier, but also the American people can understand what's the best direction for America and for various industries and constituents to go. Not easy, but I think the debate is important.
Jonathan, before I let you go on USMCA, though, what USMCA enforcement issues will the incoming administration prioritize, do you think? And when are we going to see the first USMCA labor actions initiated?
Yeah, so I think you answered your question with the first question with the second one, which is I think labor is absolutely going to be the top priority of the incoming administration. I think, candidly, it's been a little bit of a surprise to some folks that we haven't seen cases yet, because I think folks agree that the new provisions which were negotiated are important and that they should be enforced. I think this is an area where I would give credit, as I said earlier. I do want to give credit to outgoing Ambassador Lighthizer. I mean, this was a lot of work between him and incoming USTR Ty to achieve real strong support in our Congress, but also, as Ivan said earlier, to work with the Mexicans and the Canadians. Is this perfect? Is the rapid response mechanism perfect? Probably not. But, it's a real step forward. And I think, if nothing else, it's going to force the three governments to work closely on these issues, which sometimes when you have an agreement, it's not just about having the rules. It's actually just about forcing the signatories of the deal to actually work on important issues like labor and I would add environment, certainly from the Democratic standpoint. But I'm sure Kellyanne might want to add to this.
Sure. In terms of USMCA, it's it's an interesting conversation that we've started about this. I think that both parties are proud of the agreement. I did a webinar right before she was nominated with Catherine Tai, and we talked about USMCA, and I gave tremendous credit to Ambassador Lighthizer for creating this large new bipartisan consensus on trade, and she chimed in and said, well, I think the speaker would also feel the same sense of pride over the agreement, which just goes to show what a miraculous feat it was to be able to get something like that across the finish line, particularly in this political climate. In which hardly anything is moving and almost everything is politicized. So, I think in terms of enforcement, the Biden administration is also going to take similar ownership over it. and making sure the agreement is implemented. The sense that I get, having talked to a number of colleagues who are either going into the administration or are Democrats on the Hill, are to expect issues related to labor and environment to be top of mind in terms of enforcement priorities. But also, given President-elect Biden's focus on foreign policy and wanting to handle some of our bilateral relationships differently than the Trump administration did, there may be some tension between wanting to keep the positive side of a relationship at the expense of potentially some enforcement action. So I do think that we may see a change in terms of which issues are prioritized and which issues actually do make it a settlement, as opposed to just the consultative phase or maybe not being raised at all. So we'll see what happens, but I do think that both parties take a lot of pride in that agreement. It was a really remarkable achievement, and are committed to making sure that it's a success.
Thanks, Kellyanne. We have about 20 minutes left, and thanks for the questions. Continue to bring them in, but I wanted to turn to Josh for a second. I know we have a lot of energy companies on the webinar, listening to the webinar, watching the webinar today. So a question for you, Josh. What's going to happen with incomplete regulatory initiatives like the DOE's regulations related to restricting the use of foreign technologies in the bulk power system? What's your predictions on that?
It's going to be, I apologize right up front for sounding somewhat repetitive, but again, you got to run the traps on each one of these and figure out kind of how that policy connects to the larger objectives of the Biden administration. And if they can find a way to repurpose a pending regulation to serve their objectives, they very well may. If they can't, they have all the ability to either withdraw or in some cases simply just let them lay fallow and unacted on indefinitely, depending on whether they were mandated by a statute or executive order. The processes can vary, but I think you're going to have to look at each one of these very differently. So looking at something like the DOE's bulk power energy order, at its core, it's actually a very familiar approach towards foreign investment, which is let's identify risks posed by certain technologies or certain owners in critical infrastructure, certain sectors of the critical infrastructure, similar to like the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and how it can review inbound foreign investment. Only here it was for specific technologies in a specific sector. Now, you can conceive of ways that can be applied very well, relatively uncontroversially. It could fit within a CFIUS framework. It could be not overly burdensome. You can also conceive of ways it's used to disrupt smooth operation of markets to favor, certain suppliers that may have political connections, or to serve foreign policy objectives that may be unrelated. Anything, right? That order is so broad it could be used for almost anything. So I think you could see a Biden administration simply promulgate regulations that they support under that executive order. Could be much narrower, could focus on different technologies, but it's an open question. So really each one of those, to me, I think the Biden administration is likely to view them as opportunities, right? All of those incomplete regulatory schemes, they can kill the ones they don't like and really easily pick up the ones they like and be able to kind of carry them across the finish line. So again, look at each one and try to trace the lines back to Biden administration policies. This is an administration that is not going to be 100% free trade. This administration that is going to care about domestic production, is going to care about security threats. China is not going to get off easily, I think, with this administration, with any administration that wants to be able to win an election, whether midterm or re-election. So as a result, I think you can look at the justifications, expect them to be narrowed in a way that suits their objectives, but don't expect tabula rasa from this administration. They are not going to start off and wipe the slate clean. They're going to pick up the odds and ends that serve their objectives, and that bulk power order could be one of them.
Josh, this question is for you or anybody on the panel. That we've gotten a couple questions from our audience. Under a Energy Secretary Granholm, what could be expected on the trade of traditional energy products There's been a couple inquiries here about LNG exports in particular, which could possibly boost the domestic gas production, considering the general theme of leaning on renewable energy sources.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I'm happy for other people to participate. I think it's easy to fall in kind of too simple of caricatures and think, Biden administration is going to care about climate, which they will. Therefore, they will dislike everything that's related to fossil fuels or the traditional fuel base. I think that is moving way too quickly. I think look back at how Vice President Biden, the administration he existed in within the Obama administration. That was an administration where fracking, that was the birth of the modern natural gas industry, was under that administration, and the use of fracking and the importance of foreign markets. So I think you're going to see an administration that still tries to find foreign markets for a lot of these fossil fuels, whether that's natural gas or domestically produced oil, while at the same time trying to encourage a shift over to lower carbon intensity domestic electricity generation and other fuel uses. I think they're going to be able to sync those up by arguing the other countries are in different stages of their fuel transition, and it becomes very easy for them to try to have their cake and eat it too. Let's send our fossil fuels overseas to where they're in earlier stages of their clean energy transition while we move to later stages. And it all starts to fit together, I think. And again, you can draw the lines all back to the big themes: domestic jobs and climate change. If they can hit both those marks, they'll do them at the same time.
Anybody else want to talk about LNG exports, or I can move on? But I want to make sure our panelists get a chance. Okay, we have a question from a reporter. And this is, I think this is an excellent question. Do you see changes in trade policy being part of Biden's response to the coronavirus pandemic, either in the short or long term? Ivan, maybe we'll start with you. I mean, let's remind ourselves, we're all doing this from our houses, and there's a terrible pandemic going on with seems to be getting worse for now. How do you think that's going to impact the Biden administration's trade agenda?
Yeah, so I think there's two issues, right? I think the first one is that going back to something all of us have said, that because of COVID-19, we discovered a whole segment in the supply chain that makes us very vulnerable not to have domestically. So do I think that Joe Biden is going to focus on drug manufacturing, PPE, making sure that we have the capability to do it and therefore affect his trade agenda in the short term? Absolutely. I would say that Joe Biden's priorities for the first 100 days, 1 through 10, are probably going to be COVID. So, and this is one of it, right? Because part of it is that, if it happened once, it could happen again. And this is the big learning that we all have. The second thing that I think is related, isn't necessarily COVID, but I just wanted to raise this issue because there's so much news in the air that we forget about this gigantic breach, and we actually don't know the scope, and we don't know the danger, and we don't know exactly what happened. But my guess is that Joe Biden's trade agenda is going to be affected very deeply by what we uncover, and therefore going back to technology, going back to security threats. That's going to be something that he's going to have to focus on and utilize all the tools that he has. I think COVID, and again, we keep forgetting that this breach occurred because there's so much news in the air, but it's pretty ugly. Paul, you're on mute. Paul, I'm contagious. Sorry.
Well, one very minor impact of the pandemic is for me being at home and my wife making dinner with clanging around, so I've been muting myself. But Josh, what do you think about the impact of the pandemic on the trade agenda of the administration?
I think there's going to be some house cleaning that needs to be done at a minimum because, I know that I work with a number of companies that there are products that are kind of that are going to be either one-off for medical treatments or are going to be necessary for a recovery, which are going to be covered by some of these tariffs that President Biden may not want to lift all of the Section 301 tariffs, for example. I doubt he will in any quick move. However, there are exclusions he could grant for swaths of products that both could have utility in the medical response to COVID, and then as we move forward, there's going to be a need to kind of incentivize both kind of the incoming raw materials as we cut. There will be a boom on the other side of this at some point where you're going to want to help facilitate that. I think in a lot of ways, lifting some of these tariffs are some relatively easy stimulus that he'll have in the bag to try to stimulate certain industries if he wants. So I think you're going to see some around the edges of it. But fundamentally, other than a lingering isn't correct, a long-term and deep distrust of China that's going to remain in our body politic, which I think will shape our trade policy towards China in ways that you will not ever be able to fully appreciate. I think specific COVID policies will be relatively limited.
Kellyanne, I want to turn back to energy for a second because we got a question. Do you think the Biden administration will seriously consider joining CPTPP? So I wanted to get your take on that.
There's actually been quite a bit of discussion about this recently, particularly in light of RCEP concluding. I think there are three considerations with it. The first are the substantive trade and economic provisions. The second, the geostrategic rationale for it. And the third is really the domestic politics. And, in terms of the actual substantive gains for the United States, at the time, the big market access win was going to be Japan. And we did get a small win with them in terms of ag market access in the mini deal that was inked last year. And we have trade agreements already with most of the TPP countries. There is a big geostrategic reason to do it, and I think that it would be absolutely devastating for the United States if China were to begin negotiations to accede to that agreement and we stayed on the outside. But when that agreement was being considered in Congress, trying to build up a coalition against China, it just wasn't compelling. It was something that members listened to, but they were more interested in, okay, well, what's the market access for ag for my constituents and my state? And then third is the domestic politics. And, this agreement had been toxic for the past 4 years. I had one friend who called it a four-letter word for the Democrats and a four-letter word for Republicans. And I very much agreed with that assessment. It was just a no-go for the longest time. But I think as we're beginning to fold our trade policy back in under the national security umbrella, where we're really looking at ways to address the threat from China, that there is more interest in looking at CPTPP as a way forward. But there would have to be some major changes in the substantive provisions, and I'm not sure that the other countries would be up for negotiating with us for those types of changes before we could join, like in labor, for instance.
We had another question.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I just want to make a couple comments on this. One, I think, as usual, Kellyanne and I are very much aligned on these points. Second, as somebody who, with my old friend Ambassador Yider, urged then Prime Minister Noda to join TPP a decade ago, almost exactly now. I think it's difficult, and this goes to, I think, one of the key themes of what Biden and the administration want to accomplish. I think it's difficult to for folks who haven't been involved to understand how some of our trading partners feel about our withdrawal from TPP. This is sort of like what Kellyanne was describing about the Europeans and the steel tariffs. There are politicians in some of these countries who put their careers out there trying to get their countries to join and trying to get them to agree to things that the United States wanted. And then, frankly, we pulled out on the very first day of the Trump administration after, I would argue, making rather half-hearted efforts to try to join at the end of the Obama administration. So it really hurt. And I guess the reason why I say that is not to say whether we're going to join immediately or not, but to say if we're going to do it again, we better damn well do it right. Because to go through it again and not get it done right, and to these are folks who believe they're our allies in the region and who want to work with us on key issues, including the 5-letter word that starts with C. And if we don't figure out how to work with them in the economic as well as the military arena, that's a huge blow for us. I also think to my earlier comments about green energy and about climate change, to me, there's a huge opportunity here around climate change in this region. this is the fastest growing region of the world. This is where a lot of our allies are and where we want them to be. If there is a way for us to work with that region on climate change, whether it's in the context of an agreement that I can't even pronounce all of the letters in, or whether there's something else that's in the trade and investment flow area that would involve climate change, I think that's the kind of thing where this administration could show new leadership. And to my comments about then Prime Minister Noda, who, by the way, wasn't Prime Minister very long, but took this amazing step on behalf of his country to bring himself and his country closer to the United States by joining TPP at that time. Japan has announced recently that it wants to, really move forward quickly on climate change. It's really hard for them given their resources. If there is a way for the first and third economies to come together on climate change in a regional deal that then could serve as a platform for other countries, that to me is really interesting, really revolutionary, and is the kind of thinking that I'd like to see the administration think about in terms of the broader international arena and how to have benefits for the American people. It's going to be hard, but I think it's out there and possible.
Okay, we have just 5 minutes left. I'm going to take care of one question quickly. I'll do it myself. Do we see any future for the attempts to reform 232 tariff powers like the Toomey Portman plan? I would say probably not, at least in the near term. I think, the Congress is going to give the Biden administration some time, and Democrats' enthusiasm to strip 232 powers from the president probably waned on after election day. So I don't see that as the exit ramp for these 232 tariffs. That's going to have to be, they were imposed by the executive branch, and I think that they are going to have to be modified, reformed, or terminated by the executive branch. I don't think Congress is going to do it. I had promised at the beginning of this that I was going to go back to Ivan. And Ivan, I'm going to ask you to give me some predictions, and I invite others to join after them in our last 4 minutes on what you predict for the first 100 days of the Biden administration regarding trade.
Actually, nothing. I don't think trade will be an issue in the first 100 days. I think he's going to be focused on COVID, and a coronavirus second package, and probably start focusing on infrastructure. But yeah, the Biden administration is coming in hot, and we've got a COVID crisis. So my expectations is that they're not going to be able to do much other than that.
Well, we all look forward to the return of Infrastructure Week recently. Josh, any predictions?
For trade policy, I'd watch people like Tony Blinken more. We've gotten so used to watching USTR drive trade policy. I actually would watch Tony Blinken more than I would watch USTR over the first 100 days. Because if it's going to be early, it's going to be something big and diplomatic, likely with him, maybe on the European front, but likely to be more symbolic in the early stages of trying to set a framework that then could allow for the type of either relaxation of tariffs we described or pressure on China. But it's going to be these are early days setting up the basic steps they need.
Jonathan, any final thoughts?
I think the theme of the administration, starting from the president-elect on down, has been to work with the allies and make sure that we're in concert with them. So I think what I would say is look for a key issue where there can be unity among key allies, and that can be moved forward without a whole lot of political controversy.
And Kellyanne will give you the final word for the panelists.
Sure. I have 3 predictions in the first 100 days. First, I predict we will have at least one deputy USTR confirmed. Second, I predict we will have a settlement in the aircraft dispute. And then third, the exclusions for COVID-related PPE and other products coming in expires on March 31st. My prediction will be that USTR extends that. And there you go. Heard it here first.
And thank you for bringing up
Fantastic.
The aircraft dispute. We didn't even get to a lot of other EU issues. There's just so many issues we can talk about, but we tried to pack them in the 90 minutes. As I said, this webinar was recorded and it'll be available. I know it'll be on the policyresolutiongroup.com website. I'm sure it'll be on the Bracewell website as well as hoganlovells.com as well. I want to thank my panelists. I think it was a great discussion. I also want to thank our attendees for the great questions that you provided, and I wish everybody a healthy and safe New Year, and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.